Okay, we are recording. Very good. Situational Ethics, Part 2. And so the outline, I'll put it up real quick, but then I'm going to take it down. We're going to look at the propositions. We're going to take a look at the problems with this, and we're going to take a look at a polemic approach. Polemic simply means a defense. So let's take a look at the propositions here. Situational ethics or situation ethics is the position that moral decision making, that's an important phrase, moral decision making is contextual or dependent on a set of circumstances. So depending on what the circumstances are, there might be different decisions that one could exercise. That's why it's called situation ethics. It holds that moral judgments must be made within the context of the entirety of a situation, and that all normative features of a situation must be viewed as a whole. Let me say that again, and then I want to show you an illustration. Situation ethics holds that moral judgments must be made within the context of the entirety of a situation, and that all normative features of a situation must be viewed as a whole. Now, let me show you this diagram, and then we're going to back up with our slides. Oh, went too far. Here we go. This is an illustration of the last statement, okay? Abortion is a sin. A true Christian should never consider abortion. However, this is where the situation comes in. This is where they say this portion would influence the other pieces of the pie here. What is the age of the person? And if they believe that the most loving thing to do is to permit the abortion because of the age of a person, let's say a 13-year-old girl, for some reason, gets pregnant. She's got the rest of her life to live. She's trying to come out of an impoverished situation. And for her to give birth to a child and get saddled with that child and raise the child at 14, 15 years old, how would she ever go back to school and complete her high school diploma, let alone go to college, let alone enter a vocational school? So the loving thing would be permit her to get an abortion. This is a visual that illustrates that they want to take in all of the dynamics, all of the features here as a whole. But as you notice, it's that one segment over here that influences the other two. Let me see if I can back up here. There we go. All right. The guiding framework for moral decision making. Now, have you noticed the last several times, and this is all they refer to in situation ethics, moral decision making. And so as we take a look at these propositions, and the problem is that they don't seem to apply the outcome of love in any other situation other than a moral situation. Now, the guiding framework for moral decision making is stated in a variety of different ways, and it boils down to three pillars, if you please. Number one, the action must be in the most loving way. That's the first pillar. The action or the decision must be in the most loving way. The second pillar, that decision is to maximize harmony and reduce discord. The second pillar, to maximize harmony and reduce discord. And the third pillar is to enrich human existence. So the framework for situation ethics has three pillars to it. That whatever the moral decision is, it must be an act of love in the most loving way to maximize harmony and reduce discord and to enrich human existence. Now, Fletcher based situation ethics on the general Christian norm of brotherly love, which is expressed in different ways in different situations according to him. Now remember, he professed to be a Christian and professed to have lost his faith. And I think when we did his biography maybe 2 weeks ago, I strongly suggested he was not a true believer. He was not a possessor. He was merely a professor or a confessor. So he picks up on this idea of brotherly love from John 13:34. He cites Christ's command that we love one another, proving we are followers of Christ or disciples of Christ. So this is the bedrock foundation for him about situational ethics. Is this the most loving thing? Is this what Christ would do? If I'm a follower of Christ, then I should love like Christ loves. Now, situation ethics advocates that the context of the complexity of the situation, one should come to the most loving or right decision as to what to do, not what the law or the church would advise. So here we see the butting of heads of theology here. What is the most loving thing to do? And we are not going to consider what the law says, and we're not going to consider what the church says about the scriptures. Now remember, last week we mentioned to you that he held the position that the Old Testament was irrelevant to any application of moral decisions. So he continues to pit these two against each other. And of course, the thing that will be most appealing to someone is love. If you love me, you'll let me do such and such, or you will accept what I'm doing. Now, the model that he's proposing states that decision making should be based upon the circumstances of a particular situation and not upon fixed law. So if there is no fixed law, if there is no absolute, if there is neither right nor wrong, but the circumstances dictate a moral decision that has to be performed in love, that accounts greatly for this no consequence society that we're living in. He says that the only absolute is not the law, not government, not the Bible, it's love. Love should be the motive behind every decision. So, truth no longer is a motivation. Mercy is no longer a motivation. He does not see love and truth working in harmony together. He does not see love and mercy working in harmony together. The only thing that Fletcher saw with his rose-colored glasses was Love. Now, if love is your intention, then the ends justify the means. The ends justify the means. And as a biblicist, as a Christian, this does not hold water. This is a antithetical statement to the scriptures. He says justice is not in the letter of the law, it is in the distribution of love. So justice is going to depend on the person who views the entire situation and motivated to distribute his or her understanding of love to that situation. I sense headaches are beginning to develop. This gets, it seems more complicated than what it is. I'm gonna give you the problems and the solutions here for a minute, but you need to understand the major components or the essential components to this. Fletcher founded his model upon a statement found in the New Testament in 1 John 4:8, God is love. Therefore, if God is love, that is the only absolute that is applicable in human relationships about moral decision making. Not truth, but love. And that's why you get the word situation. Because what is right in one situation, according to one person who is distributing love, would be totally different for another person in a different situation. And I'm going to give you some thought-provoking questions near the end of this. All right, what is the basic problem here? Situation ethics is supposedly based upon the Bible, yet it contradicts the Bible. It contradicts the Bible. And I'll explain that to you in a minute. But I want us to see the prevalence of situation ethics in our culture. And if we can identify it in our culture, if we can become more sensitive to it, we will become more sensitive to it in the church. Because the church, if it is not on guard, will absorb what is going on in the culture because there's no watchman at the gate. One person said this: situational ethics is killing America. It is one of the causes in which we can no longer agree on right and wrong. I believe that statement is true. What I call right, you call wrong. What you call right, I call wrong. We have nothing to appeal to that is a standard that both the person who is right and wrong must submit to and yield to. How about this? How often have we heard after a mass murder event, parents assert their son had a mental illness? Does that fit into the concept of situation ethics? Or the college admissions scandal, where both of the famous movie stars were recorded as saying, I just wanted the best for our child. Therefore, I paid tens of thousands of dollars to fraudulently pass exams for entrances. Or the subsequent sentences for criminal activities, in this case with the admission scandal, that were parceled out based on the defendant, but someone else would have received a stiffer sentence. Did you notice that with Locklear and the other lady that, what, they got 14 days or they got 30 days? Somebody else who was involved with that fraudulent scheme would be incarcerated for many, many years. Is this not an example of situational ethics? Now, what about this one here? It might rub your fur wrong, but we have to honestly think about this. What about the several who were arrested after the Capitol riots saying that they were simply following the commander-in-chief? Is that situational ethics? Ethics in America is at an all-time low. We have lost our moral compass. Situational ethics has played an influential part in America's decay, coupled with the loss of moral education, parental influence, a lack of role models in society, and the feeling that others who have lied and cheated get away with it. The result is we are living in a no consequence society of holding people accountable for their actions. Now, before we go on to the polemics on how to address this, okay, is there any questions so far on the proposition or the problems?
Yeah, I don't understand your example of the Capitol riot.
Because they justified their action by pointing to the president. Situational ethics can be an example, or you can see it in blame shifting, not taking responsibility, which many of those who were arrested did just that. They blamed the president for their actions.
So I have a comment.
Go ahead.
Not so much a question, which I'm sure you are making the point anyway. The point is, there are consequences. And in most situations, it's not just one person, like the young girl who decides to get an abortion might choose it because it makes her life easier. Maybe her parents were not in favor of that. Maybe the baby's father was not in favor of that. There are consequences that reach beyond the individual's personal preference.
Yes, I agree with that. I would add a semicolon to your statement, Sherry, that at the time of their moral decision making, they did not consider the consequences.
That's true.
I agree that there are consequences. What you sow, you're going to reap. But part of the problem here with situation ethics is there is no forethought as to, if I act this way or I do this, there will be consequences that will impact my life and the life of others. All right, let's take a look at the polemic approach then here. Polemic simply means to give a defense. Fletcher's model of situation ethics appears reasonable upon first glance, but given careful consideration, its flaws become apparent. Situational ethics is based upon God is love, 1 John 4:8. Fletcher has clearly said that in his writings. However, in the very next chapter of the epistle of 1 John, we read the following words: "This is the love of God, that we keep his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome. 1 John 5:3. Now, while Fletcher holds that any may be broken in good conscience if love is one's intention, yet the Bible states that keeping God's commandments is loving God. To break any commandment, regardless of your intention, is not to love God. It's a contradiction. It's a contradiction. Therefore, the logic that the breaking of the commandment was not done in love. You cannot say God is love and then break his commandment. And God himself said, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. They are diametrically opposed. Now, let me give you 6 specific criticisms of situation ethics. 6 specific criticisms. First of all, they use bad examples. In many of the examples that Fletcher puts forth, it is a near impossible scenario that could not work out. The possibility of that is impossible. And they create, or situation ethics in their teaching, creates a scenario that is problematic. It's a bad example. It is not a genuine real life experience. Now, the 1 or 2 that I shared with you could have been real life experiences. The lady in the Nazi concentration camp and the man considering suicide to leave money behind for his family. But as we look at both of those, we were able to identify what the sin was if they acted on that. And that sin is breaking God's command. So no matter how much they loved their family or did it for their family, they would be breaking God's commandment, thus showing that by their actions they really don't love God. Second is that situational ethics is subjective. It's the person who determines what is right or wrong as they see the situation. Now, let's be mindful that as a rule, you are going to have somebody who is very emotionally involved, either as a bystander or actively involved in that situation. They're going to be very emotionally involved. They're going to be entangled in the problem that they see before them. And there's a high degree of possibility they will not be able to separate their feelings to properly analyze the data in order to make a proper moral decision. It becomes subjective. And as I mentioned earlier, what is right for you may be wrong for another person. We looked last week, if it's right for you, then go ahead and do it. Subjectivism. Number 3, it assumes we all know the consequences. It assumes we all know the consequences. And I would suggest that without a proper standard of right and wrong, no one can fully comprehend the consequences of an action. And I would add here as well that in reality, everybody has a standard of right and wrong. Every human being has a standard of right and wrong. It's called conscience. It's called conscience. So even a pagan unbeliever trying to make a moral decision about a circumstance, their conscience will be trying to guide them to a proper decision based on the facts, not on the emotions. Now, here we have to throw into the pot such things as a depraved mind, or a wounded conscience, or a defiled conscience, or an evil conscience. But the bottom line is there is a conscience there. Number 4, situational ethics does not prescribe a course of action. It can't prescribe a specific course of action because it is subjective and it doesn't have a standard. If there was a standard for adultery, then everybody would have to abide by that standard. But because there's not, one person can apply situation ethics through justification. My wife is not loving. My wife is not kind. She's always tied up with the kids. She drove me into the arms of another woman. That's situation ethics. Number 5, love can be misguided. Love can be misguided. Even for a believer who has been saved by agape love, who has been given the fruit of the Spirit, agape love, and is commanded to love one another, agape, with that same love, they have the ability to do this. Yet because of their emotions, perhaps, or they ignore a standard, then their love is misguided. Their love is misguided. And then finally, situation ethics promotes the license for permissiveness. The license for permissiveness. Permissiveness means driven by only one piece of the situation, one piece of the problem. And because of that, the dangers increase for lack of control and direction. License for permissiveness. Now, there are Christians who say that the Bible has at least 2 examples of situation ethics. Therefore, if it's in the Bible, then it must be an acceptable practice. And the 2 examples that they give are Rahab, who lied to save the Israeli spies, and David, who ate the bread from the table of showbread. Now let's pull this apart and see if there's any substance to this. The case of Rahab does not bestow divine sanction upon the practice of situation ethics. Rahab's lie is never condoned in Scripture. Rahab's lie is never condoned in Scriptures. The fact that the episode is recorded in the Bible does not mean that it is approved. There's a lot of sinful actions in the Bible by God's people. Doesn't mean that God is approving, endorsing, or promoting them. All lying is condemned according to Revelation 21:8. The narrative regarding Rahab merely provides an example of where God honored a woman due to her obedient faith despite her character flaws. Let me say that again. The narrative regarding Rahab merely provides an example of where God honored a woman due to her obedient faith, despite her character flaws. This woman was a harlot in a pagan environment, but she had developed a building faith in Jehovah. I commend your reading of Joshua chapter 2, verse 9, and the following verses. Now, accordingly, she received the Israeli spies with peace, as stated in Hebrews 11, verse 31. Her motive was right, even though her method was wrong. There is not a word in the scriptures that endorses the false story she told in concealing the spies, and it is utter desperation that grasps at this narrative to justify situation ethics. Okay, what about David? The record in Matthew chapter 12 is very interesting. It says, on a certain Sabbath day, the Lord and his disciples were traveling through a grain field. You remember this story. The disciples, being hungry, began to pluck grain and to eat. Certain Pharisees saw this and charged these men with breaking the Sabbath regulation within the Mosaic law. The fact is, the disciples had violated only the uninspired traditions of the Jewish elders. They had not transgressed the law of Moses. The essence of the Lord's argument can be seen this way. You gentlemen revered David as a great king and Hebrew hero. David once clearly broke the law by an illegal consumption of food, yet you never condemned him. On the other hand, my disciples have violated only your human traditions, and yet you charge them with sin. How very inconsistent you are. This incident contains not a vestige of support for situation ethics. Jesus plainly said that whatever David did was not lawful. Those who attempt to employ this narrative in defense of situation ethics simply have missed the master's argument and teaching. I want to fry the rest of your brain. Do not murder. Every state has a legal code about murder. The Bible commands you shall not murder. What about someone attacking you? What about the police use of deadly force? What about war? Euthanasia, the killing of the elderly and the infirm. What about abortion because of a rape? Or the doctor says you should abort the fetus because it has serious birth defects and will not live a long life. What about lying to authorities? What about the various vices? You know, if you go to any anonymous meetings, I believe you will hear situation ethics, because there is oftentimes blaming circumstances for their vice. And again, as I mentioned on January 6, 2021, and what happened on that fateful day. When we make excuses, is that a form of situational ethics? What about justifying our behavior? What about rationalizing our behavior? Does the word but indicate situational ethics? What about blaming others? Situational ethics is more prevalent and subtle than we are aware of. It has permeated our culture and church that we fail to see or choose to ignore the erosion and decay in our society and Christianity. Therefore, we do not act, and if and when we act, it is driven by emotions to help us feel better, not a body of absolute truth to make us holy. This is what a Bible-believing saint is trying to do. Shine the light of truth in the midst of a very dark world. We are trying to live out and communicate a standard of truth that we call the Bible as we live in the world and not become part of the world. Situation ethics may sound very, very alluring, but it is the cry of the siren drawing the church and the Christian into the darkness of their theology. Jesus tells us not to hide our light under a bushel. And if you give any thought to the previous 2 slides of questions that I posed to consider, and you begin to perhaps grapple with hearing others or even yourself, where you might say, yes, but is that situation ethics? When we rationalize, when we justify, when we make excuses, when we blame, I think these are forms of situation ethics, because the standard of truth is the subjectivism of that person. I know this has not necessarily been one of the easier broadcasts when it comes down to this topic. However, I hope you might give serious consideration to the prevalence of this theology that is in our culture and weaving it in to the life of the church. And if you ever get into a semi-serious conversation with somebody about the events of their life or about a situation that they might be facing, ask God to give you a listening ear that you might be able to help them hear and see what they are saying and provide them the hope. I don't believe situation ethics gives hope. In fact, I believe it robs hope from people because it's left up to a person to determine a morally right decision. And what happens when that person begins to wonder if they made the right decision or not? They struggled with their emotions to make that decision, and now when the results are not attained or what they had hoped for materializes, now those emotions become compounded in their life, and it can bring on great despair.